Thanks very much to you, Brother Connor, and to the Dominicans for welcoming me. The 300-year fight is over, and it's very nice to be here. This invitation arose out of a previous talk I get, and I see some faces from that time, Louise, Connor, and others, to young religious about 7 months ago. But in that talk, we touched on the topic of secularization, and I think it caught the imagination of some, and so that's why I'm talking about it this evening. There is a handout. The handout is the poor man's PowerPoint. But I'm 58 years old, and as you'll guess from the birth date, which he disclosed in his introduction. So PowerPoint, I can do it, but I get more involved with the PowerPoint than I do with the content, and that isn't wise. So the handout at least covers the territory, and if you fall asleep, you can ask your neighbor when you wake up, where is he now? And with any luck, it'll be somewhere like here. So the handout has its function. And it doesn't tell you by any means everything that will be said, but at least it lets you know the territory that will be covered. I asked Connor to tell me after half an hour, because then I would know I had 10 minutes to go, because where I work, we talk in natural units of 3/4 of an hour, and they can extend themselves. So I don't want to do that to you, so I'll try and keep to time. I suppose when I found I was coming here, but on the back of the previous talk, to pick up on the topic of secularization, I thought of the great Dominican Irishman, really, Father Herbert McCabe. Wouldn't you say he was Irish more than English? But you know the famous time he was silenced as the editor of New Blackfriars, and then a couple of years later, everything was okay again, and he began his editorial with the words, "As I was saying before I was oddly interrupted." So I have a certain sense of, as I was saying 7 months ago, and I'm picking up on that again now. There is often remarked today, and even Connor said it in his introduction, that Ireland has become very secularized. You hear that, don't you? We live in an increasingly secularized world, and Ireland also has become thoroughly secularized. That's what's said. But when you look at the evidence more closely, doubts and questions emerge. It can't be said straightforwardly, as we'll see, I think, tonight, while yet, of course, there's a great deal of truth to it. So I'll have a look at this, and that's why I called the talk, "Is secularization a reality today?" I know that it is, but I know that at the same time, it is not so straightforwardly so that we can just toss off yes without further ado. So the first thing I'll do will be the boring bit, like German scholarship, counting the number of words in a verse of the Bible or something. Or anyway, I'll say something about the terms, because you hear secularization, secularist, secular, secularism, and they all have slightly different nuances of meaning. So I look at those. Then in a second part, I look at the so-called secularization hypothesis. It's a hypothesis about how societies will definitely become secularized as they become more modernized. And that is questioned very much nowadays. The third thing we'll do is we'll jump from sociology, which I've mostly forgotten since my days at UCD, to theology, more of which I still remember. And we'll consider a fruitful theological relationship, or a specification of the relationship between the secular and the sacred. I'll finish then by looking at Pope Benedict XVI's challenge to contemporary Europe in 2005. He asked Europeans, thinking of the Enlightenment, when the idea was to live as if God did not exist, now he says, why don't we, at this juncture in our secularized and secularizing history, try to look at things as if God did exist and see what would come out of that. And I raise a few questions about what that might mean in Europe today, of course, and perhaps especially in Britain and Ireland. So that's the plan. They're the sections on the handout. And if you sleep, locate yourself in 1, 2, 3, or 4 when you wake up. Well, you probably use the word secular all the time, do you? That fellow's very secular in his attitudes. As an adjective, it tends to mean things like worldly rather than spiritual, doesn't it? Not specifically relating to religion or to a religious body. Like I went to a wedding and they were playing secular music rather than hymns. we speak of it in that kind of way, don't we? We also speak of it in relation to advocating a secularist agenda, moving things away from the sphere of religion and from domination by religious thinking. Sometimes we refer to it as the opposite to religious in the sense of religious life. Originally, it had a meaning that meant more lasting from century to century. But since about the 16th century, the more familiar English non-religious meaning, secular meaning non-religious, that has come into play. And that's really how we use it today, isn't it? When we say something is secular, I'm wearing secular dress with just a pinpoint of the sacred. You see, so that's how we use it nowadays. And broadly speaking, that's more or less the way it's understood. Now, secularism is slightly different because it's a doctrine, it's a way of thinking, a system of thinking, if you like, that rejects religion positively and rejects religious considerations. So it's a spirit or a tendency, even a system of political or social philosophy that rejects all forms of religious faith and worship. For example, the view that public education and other matters of civil policy should be conducted without the introduction of a religious element, that would be a view associated with secularism. Its fundamental principle is that in his conduct, or her conduct, human beings should be guided exclusively by considerations derived from the present life. Anything above or beyond the present life should be left aside. In other words, as the French man who in many ways is the father of this, I hope I pronounce his name rightly, Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, he said there's no real need at all for reference to God. So whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, all these kinds of questions, which at best cannot be answered, consequently should, the secularism people will say, be left aside. So it is more than just a kind of descriptive adjective, isn't it? It's actually an attitude, a way of seeing things. It's a program of action and thought with regard to the place of religion in social life. A secularist then would be an advocate of that program, someone who believes that religion should be excluded from things like government, education, etc. Generally, the secularist ideology is said to be one that promotes the secular as opposed to the religious, and particularly within the public sphere. Secularization, that word, the title in our talk tonight, also has different nuances of meaning. It can mean, for example, the transfer of property from ecclesiastical to civil possession. Anybody here who might be from Poland, especially if you were involved in religious life, all the Jesuits from Poland with whom I live, they tell me the buildings were taken by the secular authorities, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, they were given back. So there was some kind of reversal there in terms of the public viewpoint. But when they were taken by the communists, it was the transfer of property from ecclesiastical to civil possession. Secularization can be seen as a procedure, moving something, be it art or education or morality or society, away from the control or influence of religion. Secularization can be seen as the process of becoming secular. Societies become more secular. That happened here, didn't it? We see that without being too scientific about it. It's defined by some as the process in which mystical, sacred, and otherworldly explanations, outlooks, beliefs, and interests are replaced by rational, critical evaluations and by pragmatic and utilitarian standards. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? But any appeal to myth, to religion, to explanations that have to do with the other world, the transcendent, they're quietly put aside, and in their place, what is considered rational, scientific, and so on, is permitted. The underlying assumption, of course, is that the religious couldn't be rational, and we'll certainly question that here this evening. When you don't know a great deal about something, you go to somebody who does. And Dr. Pat Claffey, whom some of you will know, who teaches in the Milltown Institute, he's a sociologist, and so I resorted to him. He wouldn't like the word resorted. I availed of his wisdom in order to say something about these things this evening. When he explains what secularism is, for example, he does it by reference to people, and that helps students. Richard Dawkins, he says, in England, or Justin Keating here, their atheism and secular humanism would be examples of a secularist way of seeing things. He says that secularism is carried to the point that persons such as, particularly Dawkins, say they are not simply atheist, but actually anti-theist. Richard Dawkins, for instance, as you know, he sees religion as a pathology, the cause of most of the world's ills, and humanity, he is convinced, needs to rid itself of religion. According to the famous definition of Peter Berger, many of you have heard of Peter Berger, haven't you? Great religious sociologist and a religious man, teaching in Boston since the 60s, not a Catholic, but certainly a Christian. And he defined secularization over 40 years ago in a definition that I find recurring all the time, even today. In a recent Sociology of Ireland, for example, by Hilary Tovey and Perry Scher, they refer to his definition, which is referred to in the meantime by another pair of sociologists. So what Berger said then is still more or less in as a description. And he described secularization as the process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and religious symbols. It's a process, in other words. Another sociologist says it's a process in which the major areas of social life and organization, that is economy, defense, government, law, education, health, etc., become differentiated and autonomous, and in which organized religion has finally relinquished the last elements of the presidency that it once enjoyed over the whole gamut of social affairs. To some extent, we knew that presidency in this country, didn't we? Most of these areas, in fact, fell under the influence of religion and the church. These are interesting definitions because they're all definitions of process, aren't they? They imply that something is occurring or being carried out. But I detect in them also more than a suggestion that these processes are directed by people, which would make them secularist processes, wouldn't it? That is, processes following a secularizing agenda. We experience this in Europe in what is often referred to as the secularist agenda. And only recently we heard David Cameron saying, approvingly, that he welcomed, I quote, the Christian fight back against British secularism. Interesting phrase that, isn't it? And we'll come back to it. That's section 1 finished already. Are you confused on a higher level? Or you have a sense of the nuances between the different terms? But at least to keep in mind that secularization as a hypothesis about what is happening, and secularism as something which people are pushing, that is real and is a kind of doctrine. And of course, there are always doctrines and ideologies around. And when people get up and say, we're doing this from a purely neutral standpoint, secularists will say that, won't they? We're not religious, we're purely neutral. Well, there ain't no purely neutral. And it's good to be wise to that. That French bloke I mentioned earlier, the founder of sociology, he is really perhaps the person who's at the background of the secularization hypothesis that has enjoyed so much sway in sociology. Pat Claffey, my colleague, expresses it like this: the world, through a process of evolution, is moving inexorably in a secular direction, from primitive societies with an understanding by magic, through developing societies whose understanding is dominated by religion, to modern societies ruled by science. It's a clever way of saying things, isn't it? And it seduces you into thinking that the last is the best. The first societies were primitive. They worked things out by magic. Later, societies did it by religion. But we, the truly enlightened, work things out scientifically in the era of the positive. That's really the law of the 3 stages of Auguste Comte, isn't it? And it's a law that governs for him both the evolution of intellectual disciplines like history, sociology, and also the evolution of societies. So it kind of underlay in post-Enlightenment thinking a lot of the way that people were thinking when they were talking about modernization. Speaking about modernization of society, it's modernization and secularization that were put together and associated with one another, wasn't it? The idea was that as we urbanized, technologized, industrialized, we were modernizing. And concomitant with, almost inevitably, that modernization was that we were secularizing. That hypothesis, which enjoyed a long degree of favor for quite a while, has collapsed in recent years. It's very interesting that two academics, Peter Berger, whom I mentioned, and also Harvey Cox. Do some of you remember Harvey Cox? People with hair color like mine. He wrote a book in the 60s called The Secular City. And the prediction was that as life moved on and society became more modern, that religion would disappear ever more from view. Both Harvey Cox and Peter Berger shared this viewpoint. However, they both, in later writing, made the point that what they had thought would come about didn't in fact occur. The underlying assumptions of the secularization idea is, number one, that religion is irrational. Number two, that people who believe are irrational. And number three, that as the world becomes more rational, guided by science and knowledge, religion will therefore inevitably disappear. You can see that that makes sense in the situation we have described. Now, linking the theory of secularization to the theory of modernization in the way that I mentioned to you has led many people to say that, of course, secularization will become a reality. But I looked up A Sociology of Ireland by Tovey and Scher, written in 2000 and a second edition in 2003, and they say, drawing on Berger's definition from 1969, the following about secularization, and I quote them. In its broadest sense, it refers to the increasing separation of the profane and the sacred, and the gradual downgrading of the latter that has taken place since the development of agricultural societies. Secularization suggests a disenchantment, a taking away of the myths and the magic from, if you like, of society. That's a term of Max Weber. It suggests a process whereby the spiritual and the supernatural come to play a lesser role in people's lives and may be replaced by more rational and scientific modes of thinking and expression. It is also often taken to refer to the decline of religious institutions and their role in public life. This is clear in Ireland, isn't it? For example, a reduction in the political power of the churches and a decline in the status and prestige of religious figures. We know about that, don't we? And in terms closer to the contemporary common sense understanding of the concept, it can relate even to a decline in participation in formal and informal religious activities, such as weekly attendance at Mass or daily prayer. All of these things are associated with and can be markers of a secularizing trend. Now, it has long been suggested, I quote Tovey and Scher again, it has long been suggested that in all these senses, Ireland is indeed a secularizing society. You couldn't disagree, could you? I mean, those are things that we notice. Decline in church attendance, drop in religious vocations, despite the many Dominicans around us. Look at the Jesuits. You know, lack of influence or much less influence in public life of religious figures, certainly lack of respect for them, but that is due to other reasons too, as you know. But nevertheless, it has been suggested that with trends such as these, Ireland is indeed a secularizing society, particularly as it has also been seen to be a modernizing one. But then these sociologists say the matter is fairly complex, and things like religious belief, identity, and practice are not straightforward entities. As a consequence, they say, any attempt to measure the extent of secularization of Irish society today is fraught with difficulties, both of a methodological kind, how do you actually do the measuring, and also of an epistemological kind. Well, how do you know that that is secular and that this is not? Now, these views of Tovey and Perry, that measuring secularization is complex, they echo my own views in many ways. I don't think secularization is an inevitable accompaniment of urbanization, industrialization, modernization, etc. Other sociologists like Hornsby Smith and Whelan are critical, I quote, of any notion that there is an inevitable or automatic link between secularization and processes of social and economic change, such as industrialization and urbanization. They even point out that the relationship that exists between social change and religious activity is so complex. They draw, the two sociologists I mentioned, on Carol Coulter's work, quoting her, that rapid social change in itself makes the certainty offered by established religions even more attractive. So it doesn't follow that according as change occurs, the religions become more placed aside. We should be careful then of glib statements about secularized Ireland, because even the sociologists and analysts find themselves pushed by the evidence they consider to be much more nuanced in their approach. Back now to the secularization hypothesis. It went largely uncontested in the 60s, and indeed right up to the 1980s. People like Cox and Berger were believed to have predicted accurately. However, since the 1980s, many questions have been raised. It has been observed that places vary, for example. You can't talk about the whole world. It has been observed that the theory of secularization itself has to a great extent unraveled, and that we live in a world, or indeed worlds today, that are still religious, and in some cases more religious, in a myriad of different ways. So we must probe the hypothesis. People who were associated with it much back in the 1960s have a different point to make now. Harvey Cox, in The Secular City in 1968, stated that in modern society, note the word modern, secularization and modernization, that in modern society religion was in irreversible decline. This is 1968. But in 30 years later, in another book, Fire from Heaven, Cox admitted that secularity rather than religion was on the decline. Berger, who spoke in the late 1960s of the inevitability of secularization, said in his 1999 book, The Desecularization of the World, that the assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today, with some exceptions, I quote, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. This indicates that the context for thinking about the future and the future relationship between the secular and the sacred is quite different from the one that obtained 30 or 40 years ago. If you read somebody like James Skillen, who directs in Washington, D.C., a somewhat conservative Center for Public Justice, in a report that he put out in 2000, he said this. In other words, he was making a very important point here, that it was not just the case that in postmodern, post-secular societies, we use those terms now, don't we? Religion is back. That religion and spirituality are things that people are very keen on, albeit followed rather privately, eclectically. If you put spirituality into the Google search engine, you'll get 362,574 hits, approximately. That's a fair bit to be going on. So spirituality is a very broad canvas. If you go to the bookshops from Germany to Britain to here, you'll find the section on theology is small, but the section, whether it's called esoterics or mind, body, spirit or whatever, has grown enormously. Wherever you go, you definitely find that in postmodern societies that people are into something that could be classified, at least loosely speaking, as religious. But the claim is that postmodern societies only host religion when it stays privatized. Whereas I think this guy Skillen, that I'm just about to quote, is saying, no, no. Even in terms of organized religion and affiliation to it, there is much evidence across most of the world, even in the United States, though perhaps not in Europe, that in fact there is a growth in affiliation to institutional forms of religion, and not simply to privatized spiritualities. He says, one of the apparent surprises of the last decades of the 20th century was the explosion of religious vitality throughout most of the world. Then he added that this so-called surprise included the surge of Islam from the Middle East across through Indonesia and of evangelical and Pentecostal movements in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even the United States. Insofar as people join up with and affiliate to these, they are not engaged in purely private religion or spirituality. Some of these societies are postmodern, but religion is not being pushed in to an isolated corner or into some kind of potpourri arrangement where people pick and choose. I had never been to Africa until I was 54, so that's 4 years ago. I've been there 3 times since. I find Africa is an extremely religious continent, but very much in terms of organized involvement in organized religion. I've never been to South America. Many of you have, because I know there are many Dominicans there, but I believe that evangelical religion is on the rise all the time. Sometimes I know at the expense of Catholicism. Similarly in the United States. And when we talk of Islam, remember we're not just talking about Christianity, it is difficult to say that institutional forms of religion are really on the wane at the present time. It's only if we keep our consciousness firmly focused on Europe that we'd be inclined to say these things. A person I should mention here, but I won't because you'd be here all night, is somebody like Charles Taylor. You know his book, A Secular Age, exactly. And he reflects in that book how it is that we have come, many of us, to live content with the horizontal. Isn't that right? With the monochrome, perhaps, the horizontal. But this by no means refers to all the world. I haven't brought anything from Taylor with me, and what he's trying to account for is very valuable because there are lots of people in the kinds of societies that we know who basically live content with what they do, then what they manage to consume, and various forays into the aesthetic, into the entertaining, and the cultural, but without really any reference to or outreach to the transcendent. Clearly that should be of great concern to us, but I still wish to point out that it is not the reality the world over. There has been less of a flight from institutional forms of religion, as well as from personal forms of faith, than the secularization hypothesis of the 1960s suggested. And just to come back to Ireland before we finish this point, I got on the internet, don't ask Google, ask me, and there's a very impolite version of that, I believe, in a t-shirt. But anyway, I got on the internet to look at the recent census figures for 2011. Now, there's one big summary of about 124 pages called Census 2011, This is Ireland. You might have seen it, have you? Pages 42 to 43 give you a couple of overviews of religion, and then there are tables around page 106 and 107 where you can follow up the data. But some interesting things emerge. Ireland is still overwhelmingly Catholic, at least in that 84% of people identify themselves as being Catholic. That's a rise of 4.9% numerically. It's not a rise in percentage of the population, but it's not much of a drop. It's a substantial rise percentage-wise because the population of Ireland has risen. It's now over 4.48 million or something, isn't it? That was it is now. But anyway, so it's interesting that 84% of people identify themselves as being Roman Catholics, and the total number is up. However, there are other things that make you think. There has been a 45% increase in those who identify themselves as having no religion, and the percentage of 25 to 29-year-olds stating this is 13%. That's the highest percentage in any age group. So, as a religious person, I would be concerned about that. There's a clear secularizing evidence there in that a number, even though, of course, 84% for the total population is still quite high. If you want to judge then in terms of people living in accordance with the moral teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, given that 84% of people declare themselves to be Catholic, well, there are some interesting statistics that raise some questions about whether that would be happening. There are twice the number of cohabiting couples now than in 2006. But again, interestingly, the rate at which that is occurring dropped a little between 2006 and 2011. It was faster between 2002 and 2006. The percentage of divorced people has increased by 150.3%. But that also reflects to some extent, doesn't it, that the legislation there is relatively new and there has been a good deal of catch-up with regard to broken down marriages. On other matters of practice and attitude in relation to Catholic morality, data were not yet available from the census, certainly not in the report that I read. However, from the survey conducted recently for the Association of Catholic Priests by the market research company Amorach, and which was disclosed, the results of it, in the tablet recently by Father Sean McDonough, those data indicate that Irish Catholics, 84% of people are Catholic, remember, on a range of issues such as the ordination of women, married priests, and communion for divorced or separated people in stable second unions, they disagree with the teaching of their church to quite high percentages. 77% favour the ordination of women, 87% favour married priests, and the same percentage supports the availability of communion for the divorced and separated. The survey indicates that while mass attendance among us in Ireland is high by comparison with most European countries, about 35% of people attend once a week, 51% more than once a month or once a month, and the figures are low for other European countries. Nevertheless, given that 84% of people tell you that they're Catholic, you don't have to be blind to see that that is fairly interestingly interpreted, if only 35% go to Mass once a week. In the area of sexual morality, a major disconnection was discovered in that survey between what Ireland's Catholics believe and what the Church officially teaches. So the figures saying that 84% are Catholic need to be interpreted against practice in various ways. And I don't just mean church attendance. What does it mean to say one is Catholic, and how can you read these figures in terms of the secularization reality that we are talking about? I had a postgraduate student recently who just finished an interesting D.Min thesis, the subject of which was, is there a place in the church for Catholics who dissent from the non-infallible magisterium? Cardinal Arinze had said, they are problem children of the church. Mr. and Mrs. Problem Child, he said, or even Reverend Problem Child. And he was suggesting there wasn't a place for them. But of course, the student that I was the supervisor of found that a great deal of people in Ireland who declare themselves to be Catholic think there is such a place for people and that they are still Catholics, while a minority think that that is not really the case. So they would say that once they disagree, they have become secularized, although they wear the Catholic label. But the majority would say, oh, no, they're not secularized. They're still Catholics. They just don't agree with everything that the church says. So hence again, my title this evening is Secularization a Reality Today? I promised you you'd be confused on a higher level, and you will be. The indices are not straightforward. That's as much as I will say on that. Is it now? You see, thank God he told me. Okay, very briefly, a foray into the two other points. Something on the model of the secular-sacred relationship. I think that when we remain in the realm of sociology, we do less well on the relationship than if we get into the realm of theology. As I suppose I'm biased, I prefer theology to sociology. But also, I think we tend to think dichotomously in the world of social enumerating social facts, whatever, whereas in theology, we might be thinking with certain versions of both-andism, as I'll suggest in a minute. Thinking just in terms of contraries, that's sacred, not profane, that's profane, not sacred, often doesn't do justice to the phenomenon concerned, because in the secular, the sacred can indeed be detected, and sometimes I'm afraid in the sacred, what is decidedly secular can also be detected. It is often assumed that St. Thomas has a more harmonious view of the relationship between nature and grace. Isn't that right? The natural and the supernatural, the sacred and the secular. And that St. Augustine has an inhospitable relationship between those two and sees grace really as trumping nature or reversing nature, gratia sanans after all, healing grace, whereas the Thomists emphasize, if the Dominicans here will allow me to say, elevating grace. It's not fair, actually, either to the Thomists or the Dominicans to say that each side neglects one and only emphasizes the other, because, of course, it's clear that St. Thomas has both, and it's also clear that a nuanced Augustinianism has both, even if each has their accents. So I go back to that talk that we had in September, where I drew on the writing of Paul Graham, an Augustinian, who called on Augustine to refer to a per mixtum model of the relationship between the sacred and the profane. He was doing it in relation to religious life, but I think you can do it more generally. When he was talking, he referred to Ratzinger and Habermas having their discussion in the Bavarian Academy in 2004 and publishing their ideas a year later in a book called The Dialectics of Secularization. According to Graham, Habermas advocated an openness to religion on the part of secular reason, whereby it needed to recognize that religious convictions had an epistemological status that was not irrational. Note this, the secularist is saying religious propositions are not irrational. That's quite different to Kant, isn't it? In 2 centuries ago. And Ratzinger, he spoke of a necessary relatedness between reason and faith and between reason and religion. He said each is called to purify and help the other. That's mutuality. That's the religious person open to the wisdom of secularity. So if Graham is right in the reporting, and I believe he is, and I have read the book, it is interesting that in the dialogue between these two men, they are asking that the secular be engaged by, fleshed out by, sometimes purified by the religious, but also that the religious be kept rational, be kept on a solid basis by the employment of reason. Thus, says Graham, they're advocating, in fact, a nuanced per mixtum model between the sacred and the secular. Because I know I'm going to be stopped in a couple of minutes, I'm going to abandon the script and just talk to you for a minute or two. No, but you're right, people have to be released. What that means, I think, is that, you know the way St. Thomas, once called by Ratzinger St. Thomas of the Creator, St. Thomas always valued the created reality in its own excellence and autonomy and inherent good. Isn't that so? The it is good of creation is central, I think, to the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. But he was not unaware of original sin and the fall and all of that, and he was not unaware that redemption included our redemption from sin and the cross and all of that. But the it is good of creation is something that remains in Thomas's rejoicing, and his emphasis is more, I think, on elevating grace than on healing grace, without denying that grace also heals. The Augustinian tendency is to think perhaps more in terms of healing grace, because of Augustine's own experience. You remember Book 8 of the Confessions. Augustine, who so appreciated Christianity, but simply, with all his erudition, couldn't pummel himself to go there. He found he was wented, or taken, or gone. But he needed, and he was absolutely sure of this, the movement of grace to bring him to affirm the God of Christian faith. But this does not mean that Augustine, in praising the grace that heals and converts, forgets the grace that elevates and celebrates the created reality of the human. Isn't it he who speaks in what's echoed in the old preface for Holy Men and Women of God's glory, I've got to find the text because it's too complicated. In crowning the merits of the saints, God crowns God's own gifts. Isn't the proper teaching on grace, and especially on merit, that in merit really being merit for something that we do, it is something that we can only do because we do it under grace. So it is, as the preface says, God's crowning what God has already given to humanity. Augustine's genius was that he did not leave grace and freedom competitors. He did not leave the secular and the secular, the secular and the sacred competitors. He did not leave the city of God and the city of the world competitors, although many force him into talking that way, because he actually saw that grace freed freedom to delight in the good and then to follow it. So it wasn't freedom or grace, and grace or freedom, but grace and freedom. I haven't time for it here, but there are other models, occasionally found even in Ratzinger, that seem to favor the understanding of the relationship between culture and faith, or culture and gospel, in terms of that the gospel contradicts and counters the culture. So strongly confrontative models. For example, the one where he speaks of the gospel slitting the culture. Like in Amos 7:4, where Amos, the dresser of sycamore trees, referred to by St. Basil, speaks of himself as the dresser of sycamore trees whose job is to slit the plant so that the poisons run out and then it can flower and be flavorful for eating, the figs. That relationship between culture and faith tends to see culture equated with the pagan world, and it must be then slit by the gospel so that its poisons are drawn and then it is fit for use and consumption. That's a more confrontative model, but it wasn't the one that Ratzinger predominantly espoused in his dialogue with Habermas. And it is frequently the case that he does not espouse such a model when talking ad extra. Ad intra, he sometimes does. Another model that I think, based on Scripture also, that could prove a fruitful one for articulating the grace, nature, or sacred secular relationship would be the one based on Matthew 13:24-30, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. What does Jesus say to his hearers? They're very anxious to go off and get them weeds and fire them out and burn them. He says, no. Let the wheat and the weeds, the good and the bad, let them grow together in due time, and then they will be separated. And the weeds will be burnt, and the wheat will be taken into the barn. So it's a discerning model. We Jesuits like that word, St. Ignatius and all the rest. But I think it allows that culture has impurities. But it remembers also, with a St. Thomas, that culture as a human creation can have excellence. But what's important is to bring the gospel to bear on the culture, to recognize both the excellence which it can have as a human product, but also the maladies that it can have because we humans are subject to sin. But I think a permixtum model of the relationship, rather than a dichotomizing model of the relationship, in the end does justice to good St. Thomas and to good St. Augustine. So to finish, the last section is maybe something that we can talk about a bit, because I'll say less about it before the tea. But Ratzinger, writing about Europe, was very concerned that Europeans, Christians but also non-Christians, people living in Europe of a Christian heritage but not Christian anymore, didn't have the gumption anymore to get up in public spaces and say, well, we think these things based on our heritage. So Ratzinger wrote a lot of articles on Europe as a cardinal and professor. And he basically identified the essence of Europe as a synthesis of faith and reason. Europe arose, he said, as a cultural, social and historical space when Semitic thought and Greek reason met. And he uses the text of Acts 16:9, come over to Macedonia and help us. Macedonian says to Paul. So he says, true Europe is Europe with its Christian heritage that gave rise to so many good things in morality, law, human rights, etc. Europe based on that wonderful synthesis of reason, Greek reason, and Semitic faith. But he said in recent times, Europe has forgotten the Christian component of its original synthesis, and what it espouses is a positivist, secularist rationality that acknowledges only measurables and forgets transcendent value. So he says, if in the time of the Enlightenment it was appropriate because of the dominance and perhaps the arrogance even of religious authority, that Enlightenment reason should be allowed to have more space to function, and to give us a basis upon which to place things rationally. Surely now, he says, have we not come full circle? So that today, with the radical erosion of, he doesn't doubt that Europe has become very secularized, of the religious synthesis that Europe is, with the radical erosion of that, he makes a wager, Pascal-like, this is his Pascalian wager, to European Christians and all Europeans today to live as if God did exist, just as in those times the wager was to live as if God didn't. Because now he says this is what we need to do. And he says if we do this, we'll have the gumption to bring theology back into the public space, to speak the Christian voice at the secular table, to ask for theology to be heard in the public arena, and the gumption again to speak out of a heritage that is rich and lasting. He says we say in Europe, falsely, that we'd upset Muslims if we rose too strongly a Christian voice. He says nonsense. No Muslim, or indeed he said a Buddhist coming from Asia, understands a religion that is at the basis of a society and social space, but that refuses to speak up out of its very reality, when in Muslim societies Islam does, and in Buddhist societies, if you visit them, you will quite clearly see evidence everywhere of Buddhist heritage. So he said, this is a form of false politeness, and it's perplexing to our Muslim brothers and sisters, and to our brothers and sisters in the other religions as well. When Benedict spoke to the Bundestag, when Benedict spoke at Westminster, in Westminster he evoked certain parliamentary traditions and also Catholic social teaching to indicate similarities of view between what the history of British parliamentarianism and Catholic social teaching would have in common. He tried to create similar common ground with his German counterparts when he went there. When Benedict is talking ad extra, he's forever trying to draw others into the dialogue, but also create a space for Christianity to have a public voice. He met with a very favorable reception in Britain, less favorable in Germany, because when in Freiburg and other places Catholics brought up points of controversy occurring within the church, he was slow to respond to those and also made no reference to the constructive dialogue the bishops are doing at present with Catholics in Germany. Now, he hasn't been here, and we don't think he's coming. So we don't know what he'd say about religion in public space in Ireland, but I have no doubt he would take a similar line, call on us as Christians to have gumption to speak up. It's interesting to see what does it mean in Britain. I'm not impressed. David Cameron, on the one hand, spoke on the Tuesday before Easter of welcoming the Christian fight back against British secularism. He wished everybody a happy Easter, and he said something else also. Yes, in relation to wearing the cross and other emblems of Christianity, he said he was for that and that it had a long tradition. All of this is good. Reach for the symbolic heritage of Christianity, speak of an established religion and of the good it has done in your country, but then I look at his policies. I wonder what the poor think. I don't think they're too happy with some of the reductions they're experiencing at present. And I don't think that some of those things are an expression of Christianity, since they allow the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. We could debate these things, but when you raise a question of how secularized a society is, it can't be less secularized just according to the criterion that the Prime Minister welcomes public speaking about Christianity or the use of its symbolism. There are other criteria too, justice and morality. I think we find that in British society, these things are falling quite short at present, and I have no doubt that the same can be said of here. I wonder what Peter McVerry would say. I don't appeal to him because he's a Jesuit, but because he has the viewpoint of the homeless. It doesn't seem to me that they would find Ireland more Christian in recent years than it has been before. So in terms of an index of secularization, they might have something to say in favor of the view that we are secularized. So I leave this open for question. When Benedict was writing Spe Salvi, remember that encyclical? He referred to an emperor in the 4th century who hated Christians. But he said there was one thing about this emperor which was unusual. He was flabbergasted and bamboozled by Christians and the love they had one for another. What bowled him over, and he admitted it in public, was the way Christians took care of those others in need. If an atheistic, hostile emperor in the 4th century finds enough love in Christianity to indict its members as true Christians, my question would be today, what should we be looking at in Ireland that would get us indicted as Christians? And if we would be so indicted, well, that wouldn't be so bad, and we wouldn't be so secularized after all. Thank you.